You are standing over the body of someone you love. Their chest doesn't rise anymore. Their eyes are open, but there's nothing behind them. Flies are already starting to gather. You have no funeral home to call, no priest, no paperwork, no frozen storage. Just a body, a group of frightened people, and a decision that has to be made in the next few hours. Because in the heat, decay doesn't wait for grief to finish. This is the situation every single one of your ancestors faced, over and over again, for hundreds of thousands of years. Someone always died, a child, a mother, a hunter who didn't come back. And every time, the group had to figure out what to do with the body, and more importantly, what to do with the pain. You'd think this would be simple. Something dies, you leave it, you move on. That's what most animals do. But humans didn't do that. At some point, deep in our evolutionary past, we started doing something almost no other species does. We started caring for our dead on purpose. And that decision changed everything about what it means to be human. Let's start with the question nobody actually asks. Why do humans bury their dead at all? Most animals don't. A gazelle doesn't bury another gazelle. A wolf pack doesn't hold a service for a fallen member. There are a few strange exceptions. Elephants that linger near the bones of their dead. Chimpanzees that sit quietly beside a dead group member for hours. But nothing in the animal kingdom comes close to what humans do. We dig holes. We arrange bodies deliberately. We place objects next to them. We come back to visit the spot. This is called mortuary behavior, and it shows up remarkably early in the fossil record. Not tens of thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands. At a cave system in South Africa, scientists found the remains of an extinct human relative called Homo naledi, deep inside a chamber that was almost impossible to reach without deliberate effort. The bodies weren't dragged there by water or animals. They were placed there, on purpose, by other members of their species. And this happened before Homo sapiens even existed in our current form. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, Neanderthal remains were found surrounded by pollen from multiple flowering plants, leading some researchers to suggest the body may have been buried with flowers. That theory is debated today. Some scientists think the pollen came from burrowing animals, not ritual. But even the debate tells you something. The idea that a Neanderthal might have buried someone with flowers isn't considered absurd. It's considered plausible enough to argue about. By the time you get to early Homo sapiens, around 100,000 years ago, at sites like Kafse Cave in Israel, the evidence gets much harder to dispute. Bodies were placed in intentional positions. Ochre, a red mineral pigment, was found near several skeletons. Objects like animal bones and tools were placed alongside the dead. This wasn't an accident. Somebody chose to do this. And they did it again and again, across tens of thousands of years, across completely different regions of the planet, with no communication between them. That's the part that should stop you for a second. Groups of humans who never met, who lived thousands of kilometers apart, who spoke different languages that don't even exist as concepts yet, independently arrived at the same basic idea. Death deserves a response, not just disposal, a response. So here's the real question. Why would evolution bother with this? Grief costs energy. It costs time. It doesn't feed you. It doesn't protect you from predators. A group that stops to bury someone is a group that isn't hunting, isn't gathering, isn't watching for danger. From a purely survival standpoint, grief looks like a waste, unless it isn't. Psychologists have a theory about this called terror management theory, developed in the 1980s by researchers Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pishtansky. The idea is built on something the philosopher Ernest Becker wrote decades earlier. Humans are the only animal that fully understands it's going to die. Not just in the moment of danger, but as a permanent, abstract fact, hanging over every single day of life. That knowledge is a problem, a serious one. An animal that walks around constantly aware of its own inevitable death is an animal at risk of being paralyzed by fear. So, according to this theory, humans built psychological and cultural systems specifically to manage that fear. Religion, ritual, belief in an afterlife, legacy, children, art, all of it, at least partly, is a buffer against the terror of knowing you're mortal. And grief rituals, funerals, burial, Mourning ceremonies sit right at the center of that system. They're not just about the person who died. They're about the people who are still alive and now have to keep living with the knowledge that this is coming for them too. Here's something that gets lost in the modern picture of ancient life. People assume that because death was so common back then, because child mortality alone was somewhere between 30% and 50%, ancient humans must have been numb to it, hardened, almost indifferent. The archaeological record says the opposite. Infant burials from tens of thousands of years ago are often more carefully arranged than adult ones. Small bodies wrapped in what appear to be woven materials. Tiny shell beads placed near infant skeletons. Red ochre, which shows up again and again at burial sites, possibly symbolizing blood, or life, or something we simply don't have a word for anymore. At a site in Russia called Sungir, dated to around 34,000 years ago, archaeologists found 2 children buried head to head, covered in thousands of hand-carved ivory beads. Each bead would have taken real time and skill to make. Some estimates suggest the beadwork alone represented thousands of hours of labor. For 2 children, in a hunter-gatherer society where every single hour mattered for survival. That is not indifference. That is a group of people spending an enormous amount of their limited time and resources to say something to the dead, and to each other that words apparently weren't enough for. Now let's talk about something stranger. Some ancient groups didn't just bury the dead once. They practiced what's called secondary burial. The body would be buried first, left to decompose, and then later, sometimes years later, the bones would be dug up, cleaned and reburied somewhere else, often as part of a larger community ceremony. To modern ears this sounds disturbing, digging up a decomposed relative on purpose. But anthropologists who study these practices in societies where they still exist today describe something different, a slow, structured process of letting go. The first burial deals with the shock of death. The second burial, sometimes much later, becomes a kind of closing ceremony, a moment where the community collectively agrees the transition is complete. Grief, in other words, wasn't treated as a single event. It was treated as a process with stages, spread out over time, supported by other people at every step. Compare that to how a lot of modern grief works. A funeral, maybe 3 days off work, then you're expected to be functional again. Alone, mostly, because everyone around you has also gone back to their normal schedule. There's actual research on this gap. Psychologists studying grief in industrialized societies have found that prolonged, unsupported grief is strongly associated with depression, anxiety, and even physical illness. Meanwhile, cultures with strong communal mourning traditions, extended mourning periods, group rituals, shared storytelling about the dead, tend to show lower rates of what's sometimes called complicated grief, a kind of grief that never resolves because the person never had the social space to fully process it. Ancient humans, without knowing any of this science, appear to have stumbled onto something that worked. They didn't leave grieving people alone. They surrounded them. They gave grief a shape, a timeline, a community to move through it with. Let's be fair here though. It's easy to romanticize this. Ancient death was brutal in ways modern people rarely have to face. Watching half your children die before age 5, losing a hunting partner to an infected wound that a modern antibiotic would clear up in a week. Nobody sensible is arguing we should go back to that. Modern medicine, modern grief counseling, modern understanding of mental health, these are real achievements, and dismissing them would be absurd. But something did get lost along the way. The extended, communal, ritualized process of grieving got compressed into something smaller and more private. Fewer people involved, less time allowed, less shared meaning built around the loss. In a lot of modern life, grief has become something you're expected to manage quietly, on your own schedule, without disrupting anyone else's. Ancient humans never would have understood that approach. To them, someone else's grief was everyone's responsibility. A death in the group wasn't a private event happening to one family. It was something that happened to the whole group, and the whole group responded. So, how did ancient humans grieve their death? They buried them deliberately, going back further than most people realize, hundreds of thousands of years in some cases. They marked graves with flowers, pigment, and painstakingly made objects, even for children who never got the chance to grow up. They developed multi-stage rituals that gave grief room to unfold slowly, instead of forcing it into a single day. They treated mourning as a group responsibility, not a private burden one person had to carry alone. And they built entire belief systems, entire cultural structures, specifically to help each other survive the psychological weight of knowing that death comes for everyone eventually. None of this made death hurt less. It still tore through families. It still left people broken. But it meant nobody had to carry that weight by themselves. Somewhere along the way, in the transition to modern life, a lot of that shared weight got redistributed back onto the individual. And maybe that's worth thinking about the next time someone you know is grieving. Ancient humans didn't have grief counselors. They didn't have therapy or antidepressants or bereavement leave policies. What they had was each other, showing up, again and again, for as long as it took. And for most of human history, that was the only thing standing between grief and total collapse. Turns out, it was enough.